Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar with the title Erosion of the Rule of Law in Hungary and Poland, Civil Society Strikes Back. And it's organized by the Finnish League of Human Rights, Ihmisoikeusliitto. And my name is Daniel Ulin. I will moderate this webinar and the panel later today. I'm very happy to be here. It's a very interesting topic and a very hot topic, looking at the European Council last week, looking at the EU court decision this week, and also looking at what the media outlets around Europe are writing about this week and last week. The Poland and Hungary question is a hot topic. I work as a journalist normally at the Finnish broadcasting company YLE. The last 3 years I've been working mostly in the Swedish section with a discussion program, but before that, between 2015 and 2018, I was a correspondent based in Brussels, and I have several times visited Poland and Hungary, and also done a lot of stories that concerns the topics that we'll discuss today. And we are sending this from Vallila in Helsinki, and we have great experts and a great panel today. So I warmly welcome all of you behind the screen and also take part in this discussion by using the chat. We will raise questions from the chat into the discussions during this webinar. And you can also use different social platforms. And if you do that, please use the hashtag rule of law oikeusvaltio, hashtag rule of law oikeusvaltio. And some small rules. You are welcome to join the discussion, but do it as yourself. Respectful discussion, also in the chat. No harassment, no discrimination, and let us avoid making assumptions about others. But now I will give the floor to the chair of the Finnish League of Human Rights Board, Maija Jeppinen. And Maija is a doctor of social and works as an assistant professor of social work at the University of Helsinki. And Maija Jeppinen will now open this webinar. Maija, welcome.
Dear friends, our invited speakers, especially our international guests, and all participants of this webinar. Welcome to this very important and timely event concerning the rule of law, democracy and human rights in Hungary and Poland. Several member states of the EU have taken major steps backwards in the rule of law, democracy and human rights. Hungary and Poland are in the front of this alarming development. The actions by the governments of Hungary and Poland threaten the judicial independence and freedom of the media and undermine the rule of law as well as the respect for human rights. For instance, in Poland, independence of the court is at risk. And Poland's Constitutional Tribunal concluded that the national constitution had primacy over the EU law. In addition, particularly, the government in Poland is constantly undermining sexual and reproductive health and rights. An infamous example of this is that abortions were practically banned a year ago. And anti-gender movement has strengthened also. And the Istanbul Convention has been questioned. Women's human rights defenders face threats, attacks, and a hostile and dangerous environment. In Hungary, on the other hand, the government has repeatedly and deliberately attacked on democratic institutions and human rights, civil society, and the independent media under attack, and an anti-LGBT law has been introduced. How can civil society in Poland and Hungary operate in this environment? What is the role of human rights defenders? Are the core values of the EU at risk? How should the EU and its member states react? In this seminar, we will discuss these issues with top human rights experts, researchers, and politicians. We are particularly happy that representatives of the civil society organizations from Poland and Hungary are present here today. They are Andras Lederer, who is Senior Advocacy Officer at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, and Elisa Rutinovska, lawyer at the Civil Development Forum and pro bono lawyer for human rights activists in Poland. We are very, very pleased to have you here in Helsinki today, Andras and Elisa. On behalf of the Finnish League for Human Rights, I want to thank all the invited speakers and all the organizers of this seminar, and wish you all an intriguing and thought-provoking seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Maija. And we heard about the severe attacks on the rule of law, on democracy, on human rights that we will discuss today. And this webinar is part of the project in Finnish, EUn kivijalkahorjuu, ihmisoikeuksien ja oikeusvaltion tila Euroopassa, the foundation of EU under threat, the state of human rights and the rule of law in Europe. And this project is funded by the Europe Information Grants of Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. And as we all know, the conflict between EU and the two member states, Poland and Hungary, is not a new conflict. It has been going on for many years already. I remember myself doing the first news story from Hungary in the spring 2015. It was a different time. I visited the border between Hungary and Serbia. It was before the fence. No one thought then at that time that Mr. Orban really will build the fence between the member state Hungary and the non-EU member state Serbia. I then tried to understand what the Fidesz popularity is based on, and Fidesz is still a popular party, even if there are also opposition right now that maybe can do something in the elections next year. Let's talk about that later. In 2015, the party Law and Justice in Poland also won the parliamentary majority, and after that, it's been on a downturn, if you see it from this perspective. But we also know that there's maybe a new dimension in this crisis right now, especially after the Polish Constitutional Court. And the question that we will discuss today is, has the Polish government now crossed the last red line? And will EU react this time for real, or is it just going to continue this struggle? But please, I remind you once again, join the discussion on the chat, be active there, and also on the social media platforms using the hashtag rule of law and oikeusvaltio. And you find Ihmisoikeusliitto also on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you are active in the chat, which I hope you are, you can also write there who you are and from where you are following this webinar. It's not compulsory, but it would be nice. And as Maja already told us, today's program, we will first hear from our experts, Finnish, Hungarian and Polish experts, and after that we will have a panel. And in the panel we also have two politicians, Heidi Hautala, a very experienced member of the European Parliament, and Johannes Koskinen, a member of the Finnish Parliament and a former Minister of Justice in Finland. And as you all have noticed, this webinar is in English, and it will be interpreted to Finnish Sign Language. And our interpreters today are Ellen Huang and Kati Lackner. And we will also publish a recording of the webinar with subtitles, and it will be distributed to our participants later. But now it's time to give the floor to Mr. Tuomas Ojanen, Professor of Constitutional Law at the University in Helsinki, and he will speak about the interconnections between the rule of law and human rights. Tuomas, welcome, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Good afternoon. My pleasure to be able to speak in this high-profile webinar focusing on the rule of law, including some alarming developments going on in certain EU member states, in particular Hungary and Poland. Now, the organizers of this webinar has kindly asked me to provide a short overview of what the rule of law is all about. As I'm much more obedient nowadays than I was back there in the secondary school, I try to do the job. However, since this webinar is organized by the Finnish League for Human Rights, I will not only focus on the rule of law as such, but especially on the relationship between rule of law on the one hand and human rights on the other hand. Especially, I try to lift into attention how the protection and promotion of human rights may be beneficial and may enrich the rule of law toolbox of the European Union, including its member states. Now, let me start by enriching your understanding about what the rule of law is all about. According to the European Commission for Democracy through Law of the Council of Europe, much better known as the so-called Venice Commission, the following 6 distinct yet closely interrelated and cumulative core elements make up the rule of law and define what the rule of law is all about. Those are now these core elements suggested by the Venice Commission to be seen on the screen. There are, as I said, 6 distinct yet closely interrelated cumulative core elements. And if we take a closer look at those core elements of the rule of law, we are easily led to see that the rule of law and human rights, they really go hand in hand and are closely intertwined. As you can see, for instance, criterion or core element 5 especially mentions respect for human rights as one of the core elements of the rule of law. In addition, there is element 6 explicitly providing that one of the core elements of the rule of law is constituted by non-discrimination and equality before the law. One simplified it can be said in light of these core elements of the rule of law proposed by the Venice Commission that the notion of the rule of law basically requires a system of certain and foreseeable law where everyone has the right to be treated by all decision makers with dignity, equality, and rationality, and in accordance with the laws, including to have the opportunity to challenge decisions before independent and impartial courts through fair procedures. It also deserves emphasis that the rule of law must be applied at all levels of power, especially to the extent that public power is concerned. However, for our present purposes, the most important lesson to be drawn from these core elements of the rule of law is that they combine to illustrate that the rule of law and human rights go hand in hand, are closely interlinked and intertwined, and that the relationship between the rule of law on the one hand and human rights on the other hand must really be understood as complementary and mutually reinforcing. On the one hand, the protection and promotion of human rights can only be realized through the observance of the rule of law. The observance of the rule of law is absolutely vital to the effective protection of human rights. The case law of the European Human Rights Court introduces and includes a number of striking judicial observations on how the rule of law can be used to consolidate the protection of the European Human Rights Convention, but we cannot enter this multifaceted case law in detail now. On the other hand, the rule of law would remain an empty shell or a rhetorical balloon without human rights and without the effective protection and promotion of human rights. What is more, human rights add a number of substantive elements to rule of law. Without human rights, the rule of law may easily decay to a purely formalistic concept, basically requiring that any action of public authorities be authorized by law. To be sure, while the distinction between the rule of law and rule by law may sound subtle and slender, it is of supreme significance, since rule of law represents nothing but a distorted understanding of the rule of law. It also deserves emphasis that several human rights, especially such human rights as the right to a fair trial and access to justice in general, freedom of expression, the prohibition of discrimination, and the prohibition of retroactivity of criminal legislation enshrine crucial aspects of the rule of law. The European Human Rights Court, for instance, has consistently held in its case law on Article 6 of the European Human Rights Convention on the right to a fair trial, that this right refers to the principles of the rule of law and the avoidance of arbitrary power which underline much of the European Human Rights Convention. The case law by the European Human Rights Court abounds with judgments that combine to illustrate how human rights guaranteed by the European Human Rights Convention indeed provide essential elements of the rule of law which occupies a prominent place in the system of rights protection under the European Human Rights Convention. Of course, the same can be said of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights or various catalogues of fundamental rights in the domestic constitutions of the EU member states, Finland, for instance. However, we must be very careful not to fall into the trap of thinking that only fundamental civil and political rights highlight crucial elements of the rule of law. Social rights also feature as essential components of the rule of law, especially to the extent that social rights offer protection against social exclusion and discrimination. The European Committee of Social Rights, monitoring the observance of the European Social Charter, which is the other cornerstone of the system of human rights protection within the Council of Europe, has made a number of references to the rule of law in its decisions within complaints procedure or in its concluding observations or statements for interpretation within reporting procedures. It is important to emphasize that the rule of law is also very much about protecting the most vulnerable people in our societies. Given that several human rights guaranteed by the European Human Rights Convention and other international human rights treaties, including the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights and domestic constitutional catalogues on fundamental rights, enshrine crucial aspects of the rule of law, it follows that domestic and international mechanisms of human rights protection and promotion combine to be beneficial to the rule of law framework of the European Union and its member states. Hence, judgments and decisions originating in judicial proceedings or complaints procedures under international human rights treaties, as well as such non-judicial mechanisms of human rights protection as reporting procedures, human rights impact assessment, human rights indicators, all the work done by national human rights institutions, NGOs such as the Finnish League for Human Rights and other stakeholders can provide valuable data as well as tools for complementing and elaborating the rule of law toolbox of the European Union and its member states. For instance, judgments and decisions of treaty bodies of international human rights treaties, of their conclusions within reporting procedures, can display systematic shortcomings in not only the observance of human rights, but also in the observance of the rule of law in a given state. To provide another illustration, human rights indicators nowadays play a significant role in human rights monitoring by generating data related to certain institutional or normative developments, to specific events, or to the situation existing within a particular territory or population that are related to human rights standards. Therefore, human rights indicators can also lift into attention a great deal of valuable data related to the rule of law too. Inclusion, we can emerge from the maze of these observations with the finding that the rule of law and human rights really go hand in hand and are closely intertwined and interlinked in a number of ways. And what is more, human rights provide a number of such elements without which the rule of law would remain but an empty shell or a rhetorical balloon. Thank you for attending.
Thank you very much, Professor Tuomas Ojanen, and thank you also for the reminder of what the rule of law really is. I remember when I was for some years ago reporting about breaches towards the rule of law, and this question, and the producer said to me, can you please explain for our viewers and listeners what the rule of law really is? And it wasn't so easy, even if I've been studying international law as a major in the Åbo Akademi University in Turku from some years ago. So maybe we will take it for granted here in Finland, but that is not the case in Poland and neither in Hungary. And now we will immerse ourselves in the situation in Poland. I will give the floor to Elisa Rutjanowska, who's a lawyer and at the Civil Development Forum, and also a pro bono lawyer for human rights activists in Poland. Elisa, welcome.
Thank you. First and foremost, I would like to give you all a word of warning. My speech today will be most likely seen as an act of indictment against the current Polish government. I wanted to highlight one very important issue. Whenever I or other human rights lawyers and rule of law lawyers speak out against what is going on in our country, we are not speaking out against our country. We are speaking for Poland and for the Polish nation. I come to you with a cautionary tale against what can happen once you take democracy, human rights, and the rule of law for granted. We have just heard the 6 pillars of the rule of law. And I would like to go through them one by one to show you exactly the mechanisms of the erosion, behind the erosion of the rule of law, and how it happens in the 21st century in a modern country, which even states in Article 2 of its own constitution that it is a democratic state of law. Legality, the transparency, accountability, a democratic process of implementing laws. The moment you hear that your government is trying to push through a legal act very quickly, a complicated legal act that has not been priorly consulted with anyone, that is the moment when you have to start feeling alarmed. That is exactly how the erosion of the rule of law in Poland started. The legal acts, the implementation of new laws started to become only the issue of the governing party. The opposition was considered as an obstacle. The parliamentary debate was almost entirely seized. We have been witnessing an immense amount of pressure put on the velocity, the speed to implement new legal acts in immense measures as well. And the amount of new legal acts that was pushed through in a very short amount of time was also unheard of. We thought that was our biggest problem back then in 2015, 2016. But then the worst part happened was what was in those legal acts. Not consulted, contrary to our constitution, contrary to our constitutional values, such as the independence of the courts. Legal acts were being pushed through in packages. Now, how do you deal with that? How do you question that? In a normal democratic situation, you would file a statement that would be heard. You would file an opinion that would be read. You would hear a parliamentary debate in the commissions, in the parliament itself. That was not the case. The new ruling coalition knew better what was good for the nation itself. They pushed through, they powered through with disregard to Polish constitutional standards, to European, EU values as well. The disregard was so high that even once the EU took notice and started reacting and calling out the Polish government on what it was doing to its courts, on how it politicized the Constitutional Tribunal by not by choosing its own judges and overriding the choices of the previous government and not swearing in the 3 judges that were supposed to be sworn in, but choosing somebody else in their place. So, and therefore creating double judges, and therefore interfering in a constitutionally, in an independent court. The worries coming from the EU were disregarded. They were not taken into account. They were ignored. And therefore, once that took place, why should the Polish government take into account any other opinions that were put forth from the EU or from any other body, or from the Polish opposition parties, or from rule of law lawyers? Suddenly it became quite clear that they can do anything and everything. Legal certainty, the second point that was made today, became a thing of the past. Whenever the Polish governing coalition saw that they needed to do something quickly, or that something was on their political agenda, legal certainty went out the window. Legal acts were and are continuing to be pushed through, addressing very, very specific cases. A good example of that is the attempt to implement a legal act concerning one broadcasting company, one private broadcasting company, TVN, which is the last biggest independent broadcasting TV station in Poland. That is critical and often in an objective way of the government. The governing coalition did not like that. They decided that it would be a good idea to try and take away the concession, the possibility to air in Poland, and so they created a legal act which would enable them to do so. This was stopped due to civil society fighting back. This was stopped thanks to the thousands of people who understood the importance of independent media. This was stopped thanks to the fact that the public broadcaster media and the media in Poland is almost entirely a propaganda tube for the government. However, again, we cannot be certain that these ideas will not come back into play. The prohibition of arbitrariness, of arbitrary decision-making, again, in an eroded state of law, this is a tale of the past. We can never be sure how a case will be settled by the coalition, by the governing coalition, and a problem, how will it be settled by the coalition? Because we never know what's on the political agenda, and we never know what choices will be best for that political agenda. The arbitrariness of decision-making right now in Poland is, again, the fundament of what is going on, the basis for a lot of the decision-making by the governing coalition and the government itself. Access to justice before independent courts. One of the first issues that is always being attacked by populists is the question of independence. Independence is the enemy, the key enemy of anyone who wants to create a quasi-authoritarian regime in the middle of Europe. Independence of the media, independence of the courts, independence of civil society. Independence of the courts was not only attacked through the changes to the National Council of the Judiciary, which also became politicized, a body responsible for appointing new judges and for their paths as judges, for them gaining new positions as well. So that was taken away from the value of independence. The independence of the Constitutional Tribunal, as I've already mentioned, has also been taken away. Now we are encountering an attack on the Supreme Court and an attempt at actually attacking our common courts. We are hearing talks of propositions to change the entire judicial system so as to make it more simple for the common person. But in reality, this means that a re-verification of all judges who are right now sitting in the common courts. And in a regime such as the one that we have in Poland right now, that may mean checking whether every judge in Poland can be trusted by the government. We are looking at a situation where a disciplinary chamber lacking the value of independence, so the essence of being a real court, is functioning quite well within the building of the Supreme Court, with disregard to interim measures, to rulings done by the ECJ, with the Polish government openly stating it will not pay the fines. Why should they? At the same time, that disciplinary chamber is going after independent prosecutors, independent judges, those who dare to speak up against what is going on, those who dare to speak up for the Polish people and for Poland to remain within the EU. Respect for human rights, the fifth pillar. Over the past 6 years, as a human rights lawyer, as a human rights advocate, it is quite difficult for me to explain to you how incredibly difficult it is to see an EU country basically questioning the essence of our democracy, which is regard and respect for every human being's dignity. The respect for women's rights as human rights is gone. The pandemic, a time of uncertainty, a time of death, a time of extreme crisis for every country in the world and for every citizen of the world, that time has been used to strip Polish women from their basic rights. Their rights to freedom from torture and their rights to dignity. Polish women at the moment are forced by the state to give birth to children that have no viable possibility to live after their birth. That is unheard of. That is what we have been trying to fight. And yet the political agenda won over human dignity. Non-discrimination and equality before the law. Equality before the law in a state where arbitrariness is raised to the level it is in Poland is almost impossible. It is extremely difficult and near to impossible to win with a party that currently presides over every single public institution. I call this the zombification of legal institutions. What does that mean exactly? Imagine every single public institution that you trust, including the prosecutor's office, including the police, including the bodies which take care of the public media, to actually only be those bodies by name, to only resemble them somewhat in shape to what they were before. What happens now is the public prosecutor's office is entirely dependent upon the prosecutor general, who in turn is also the Minister of Justice. The merge of those two entities into one person, one physical politician, means that every single decision made by every single prosecutor in Poland can become a political one, can become a political issue. To provide you with an example on this, last year we had presidential elections. which didn't happen. Why didn't they happen? We were in the middle of the pandemic. Everybody was asking the government to declare a state of emergency. According to the Polish constitution, a state of emergency completely excludes the possibility of elections taking place. However, that was not done, and the governing coalition was powering through to create some sort of ballot elections. We only heard a few days before the planned elections that they would not happen. However, everything was already paid for by taxpayers' money. Was there an investigation launched into it? There wasn't. The prosecutor's office decided that there was no crime done. There was no crime committed. Therefore, 70 million zlotych of taxpayers' money got lost. The prosecutor who actually decided to launch an investigation into the question of the elections had that case taken away, had that case dropped, and she herself was relegated to a smaller town. Non-discrimination also has a very human dimension to it. We are talking about everyday citizens feeling safe within their own country. We are talking about the LGBTI community feeling safe within their own country. Last year, during the presidential campaign, we have heard the governing coalition's candidate openly stating that the LGBTI community is an ideology, a dangerous ideology. This all happens in a country where homophobia is on the rise, where I myself was a witness of the Rainbow Night, the so-called Rainbow Night that happened last year on the 7th of August, where around 50 people were arrested for peacefully protesting against the hateful anti-LGBT propaganda. We were prevented from accessing our clients into the middle of the night. We were uncertain of where our clients were being transported to. But this was all a prelude to what happened afterwards during the protests regarding the violation of women's rights during the Polish women's strike in the following months. I have been witness to people being apprehended on the streets, driven out 30, 40, 50 kilometers outside of Warsaw. When I asked the police officers why were they driving those people out so far from the city center, the official response was, well, that's just the procedures. We're driving out the ones we catch early so that the ones that we catch later on and apprehend later on will be placed in police precincts in Warsaw. Of course, that did not make any sense. The real reason behind that was to create a chilling effect that makes you think twice before you go out protesting on the streets again. A chilling effect because this did not only mean adults being apprehended. This also meant the prosecution of minors for demoralization charges. What was the demoralization in protesting? Well, protesting in an illegal way and participating in an illegal assembly. Why was it illegal, would you say? The right to peaceful assembly is actually enshrined in every single standard you could possibly think of, including the European Convention on Human Rights. Well, if you got the pandemic on your side, you can always use it and abuse it to create a statement about illegal assemblies. To finish, I wanted to draw your attention to the issue we are facing today on our border with Belarus. I cannot tell you exactly what is going on there. Why? Because no media is allowed to enter the state of emergency zone. The state of emergency that was introduced on our border was introduced for the first time since its creation. We are looking at using the law in an instrumental way by the government to create a curtain behind which the government can do as it pleases. What we hear now is that border guards are apprehending people caught on in our forests. That part of Poland is extremely swampy and full of forests. And then driving them out in the middle of the night and dropping them off in the middle of nowhere as close to the Belarusian border as possible. We're also talking about women, children. When I wrote a piece about the right of a border guard or a police officer or a soldier to refuse to carry out an order which makes him or her commit a crime, the public media said I was threatening, wrote a piece on this and said I was threatening the border guards with criminal charges. Well, if us, human rights lawyers and rule of law lawyers, standing up here and talking to you about these issues, is us threatening? Well then, I guess we are. We are threatening you in terms of informing you about human rights, about the rule of law. And that is not a threat. That is simply information that we would wish you to abide by, and that keeps us, Polish citizens and EU citizens, and others who enter into our borders safe, and that respects our dignity as humans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elisa, for sharing this shocking reality of the situation in Poland, and also giving us a picture of the gravity of the actions taken by the government, who has the ironic name Law and Justice. We will discuss, of course, these questions in the panel a little bit later on. How is this possible in an EU country to questioning the core values, as we have heard that the Polish government is doing. But now we will hear about the situation in Hungary, and I will give the floor to András Lederer, who is a senior advocacy officer for the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, and he will now give his view of the situation in Hungary, and after that we will have a short break, and after that a panel. But András, welcome.
Thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to everyone who is following us live now or is watching this later on. My name is András Lederer, and I'm with the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, Hungary's oldest and largest human rights organization. We provide every year free of charge legal assistance to thousands of people, about half of them Hungarian citizens, whose fundamental rights were infringed by the Hungarian authorities, by the Hungarian state. And we are the only ones currently in Hungary who provide free of charge legal assistance to asylum seekers and refugees. I'm actually very grateful for Professor Oyerman for his meticulous introduction into what the Venice Commission considers as key elements of the rule of law. And the reason I'm very grateful for that is that when I was invited to speak today, I had a really hard time to imagine how to present the situation to you in a way that you can actually understand the gravity. Shall I pick a specific human rights issue? LGBT rights, the situation of the Roma minority in Hungary, refugees and asylum seekers, Or shall I just discuss the creeping destruction of the independence of the judiciary? It is happening through a very complex web of legal instruments. You might not be very interested in following those details. Or shall I speak about the Orwellian propaganda machinery that ate up about half of the Hungarian media landscape? To give you an example, yesterday I had the privilege to give an interview to Yle, both to the Swedish and both for the Finnish edition. And we were joking with my colleagues that none of us have been invited for over a decade to speak about any kind of issue in the Hungarian public media. Or shall I speak about how the government has been targeting independent civil society for the past 4 or 5 years, how me and my colleagues are threatened with jail for providing assistance to asylum seekers. And I decided not to do any of this. I decided to share a very concrete day from last November, a very concrete story about how we as Hungarian human rights defenders live our life. And the reason I'm so grateful for the professor's introduction is because you will realize that the story touches upon practically all elements of what he described. So this starts as an ordinary day in November in 2020. It's cold, it's misty, it's ugly. All you want to do is go back to bed. But instead, I actually have a coffee and I start reading the news, and I see that there is rumor that the government is going to introduce a new set of restrictions because of the pandemic. We are past, by then, the first Authorization Act. We are, in fact, already past the second one as well. Both were adopted using the supermajority, the constitutional majority of the governing party amidst domestic, international, including EU-level protest and criticism. These acts, they authorize the government to rule by decree during a state of danger. That's a kind of emergency situation in Hungary that can only be declared by the government and can only be terminated by the government. During such times, normally, originally, according to the constitution, the government is able to issue decrees that restrict or suspend fundamental rights, for example, the right to protest. And these decrees can also override acts of parliament, a thing that is otherwise impossible. These decrees must originally be only in place for 15 days, precisely because they are so invasive. And after 15 days, Parliament should approve them individually and prolong the force of these decrees. Now, this is what is called oversight in a parliamentary democracy. The first Authorization Act, back from March 2020, from the beginning of the pandemic, automatically extended the force of these decrees to the end of the state of danger, a time that was not known to anyone, because it is the prerogative of the government to decide on that. The move allowed the government to issue decrees that had clearly nothing to do with the pandemic, because the Authorization Act also said that these special decrees can practically relate to anything, not just strictly to the management of the pandemic, but to anything. So that is why, for example, one of these special decrees removed an opposition-led municipality's jurisdiction from a part of the town where a factory was being expanded amidst strong opposition, both by the local municipality and the population. After the decree, the municipality lost all rights to regulate what's happening on the territory of the factory. it also lost all revenues coming from the factory. What does it have to do with the pandemic or the management of the pandemic? Another decree transferred the ownership rights of one particular cardboard factory. It transferred the rights of ownership to the state. It turned out later what was the reason we couldn't figure out. Well, the company had a number of lawsuits pending against the government. Once the management was fired and the new one appointed by the state immediately terminated all pending lawsuits. Once this could no longer be reversed, the owners got back the right of ownership of the factory. But these are stories from last spring, so let me come back to our jolly November day. After a brief break in the summer, we are again living under a special legal order in Hungary, and the government regularly issues these special decrees, and they remain in force for an unforeseeable time. The pandemic is spiraling totally out of control. For weeks, experts have been already calling on the government to introduce restrictions to no avail. On this November morning, an announcement is made that very serious restrictions will be introduced as of the next day. No details are provided, no further information is available throughout the day. People, and I mean 10 million people living in Hungary, are glued to news sites, to TV and radio stations, the website of the National Gazette where these special decrees must be published, to find out what the restrictions are. It is well past dinner time, and parents still have no idea if they can take their kids to kindergarten or school the next morning. It is past 10 in the evening, and for example, waiters in restaurants don't know if they have to show up the next morning or restaurants and bars have to close. It is almost 11 o'clock in the evening, and students living in dormitories don't know if they have to move out the next day. Then finally, the National Gazette is published. We were reading the rules with my colleagues so that we translate these complex legalese into layman terms so that people would actually understand what they mean, when I realized that something else is happening. Out of nowhere, a set of bills appear just a bit before midnight on the Parliament's website. All of these bills are submitted by the government. One of them is an amendment to the Hungarian constitution. Another one is an omnibus bill, which is called Amendments to Certain Acts Related to Justice. And there is a third one, Amendments to Certain Acts Related to Elections. These three bills consist of almost 100 pages together. None of these bills were included in the government's legislative plan. None of these bills were up for consultation, either with professionals, with stakeholders, with experts, or with the general public. This might be a surprise for you, but unfortunately this is the way Hungarian laws are being made for almost a decade now. So you would expect in that November day that the government will be busy drafting the restrictions and communicating about the restrictions that enter into force the next morning. But this is not happening. What they are busy with is, for example, the new amendment to the Constitution, which humiliated and curtailed the rights of the LGBTI community. It also restricted the notion of public funds, undermining the state's transparency and the freedom of information. It also ensured that public funds channeled into public trust funds, a new concept in Hungary, will remain untouchable for all future governments. And with the election laws being changed, it severely shrank the possibilities of opposition parties to coordinate their candidates when running in parliamentary elections, which are due to be held next spring. So around 2:30 in the morning, we, with my colleagues, we finished reading the proposals and managed to get an understanding of what they include. That's just an ordinary day in illiberal Hungary. But let's look at what these amendments are. So the 9th amendment to the fundamental law, Hungary's constitution, deserves special mention here. The fundamental law, the new constitution, was introduced by Fidesz back in 2011, almost 10 years ago, after they won their first supermajority at the elections. Before this new constitution was adopted, the previous one was amended by no less than 12 times within 2 years, solely by the votes of the governing majority. 12 times in 2 years. You might guess there were no wide-ranging consultations about any of these. And then after the adoption of the new constitution, the fundamental law, which was also introduced solely by the votes of the governing majority, they amended it again 9 times. That's 21 constitutional amendments within a decade. I checked, and I hope I have the correct number for that, how many times the Finnish constitution was amended since 2000. And I found 4 times over 20 years. In Hungary, 21 times in a decade. As the Venice Commission has already noted back in 2013 regarding the 4th amendment to the new constitution, and I quote, "Frequent constitutional amendments are a worrying sign of an instrumental attitude towards the constitution, as is the resort to the exceptional 2/3 majority in constitutional making without a genuine effort to form a wide-ranging political consensus and without any public consultation." The 9th Amendment is a perfect example of this instrumental attitude. Parts of it restructured the framework of special legal orders or emergencies, but these will only enter into force in July 2023. The rest of it, though, it entered into force the day after the adoption. So what are these? For example, what was extremely important to put in the constitution during the pandemic, during a state of emergency, is that, and I quote, "the mother is a female, the father is a male." This declaration would have little legal consequence in itself. But the other bills submitted during the same night established that only married couples are allowed to adopt children. Another provision of the 9th Amendment includes that, and I quote again, "Hungary shall protect the right of children to their identity in line with their sex at birth, and shall ensure an upbringing in accordance with the values based on our homeland's constitutional identity and Christian culture." You would think that it could actually be funny to prescribe the upbringing of children in line with the constitutional identity in a country where this very constitution is amended 21 times. But this is not funny. This severely stigmatizes transgender people. And as you are very much aware, these changes paved the way to this year's extremely homophobic legislation. But last November, we didn't know what was coming. Another provision of the 9th Amendment provides a new definition of what public funds are. This is a vital issue in a country that ranks 69th on Transparency International's corruption index. For reference, Finland ranks 3rd. According to this new definition, public funds are the revenues, expenditures, and receivables of the state. This is necessary in order to assist various entities in denying freedom of information requests. Over the past couple of years, a number of high-profile scandals concerned denied freedom of information requests by entities that use funds that originate from the central budget, that are public funds. These informations all inquired about the way these funds were spent by these entities. In these cases, the argument to deny the information was that these funds had, and I quote, lost their public nature once they were transferred from the central budget. This was how, for example, the Hungarian National Bank, the central bank of Hungary, tried to hide how it channeled out almost 700 million euros at the stroke of a pen to a number of foundations it established out of nowhere, exactly for this purpose. The absurdity of the logic is obviously quite clear. However, this is no longer an absurdity. This is written into the Constitution. Lastly, the amendment also introduced additional protection to a legal construct introduced 2 years ago to endow government-friendly entities with immense amount of wealth. Public trust funds are the format to which a number of higher education institutions were also transferred. The most well-known example was the University of Theatre and Film Arts, where students and academic staff went on strike for 3 months to protest this handover, as is usually the case in Hungary, to no avail. The original concern was that these structures no longer guarantee academic freedom and that public universities become private entities. But the new provisions of the fundamental law prescribe that any rules related to these trust funds are so-called cardinal laws. This is, again, a very special construct we have. Cardinal laws require 2/3 majority, a constitutional majority in parliament, to amend. This was already quite suspicious at 2 a.m. in the morning last November. But its true aim actually became clear in the spring this year, when the government transformed 32 entities into this format. And by then, these funds were already shielded from potential public scrutiny. Remember the other amendment on the definition of what are public funds? Further changes established that public wealth transferred for free to these funds cannot be taken back by the current or any future government, even once the funds no longer carry out any public function. Any future government also lost control over the management of these funds, as the government transferred the founding rights to the management board. So if someone resigns from this management board, if someone dies in the management board, if there is a conflict of interest for which they have to terminate their membership in the management, it's no longer the government, the future or the present, who decides who becomes a new member. It's the existing management board that picks a new member. The exact value of the transferred assets, these are public assets, the exact value still today is unknown. But it includes real estate, for example, castles, land, bonds, shares, even animals. Transparency International Hungary's estimate puts the value of only the shares of state-owned companies transferred to some of these entities around 3 billion euros. If you think that the irremovable management of these new funds are one way or the other related to the current government, you're right. This was so much the case that on one occasion, the same person who happens to be the chairman of one such entity also happens to be a state secretary in the Prime Minister's office. Let me give you an example. This is like as if Finnair's state-owned shares would be handed over for free to a new entity established by the government and headed by a state secretary that at the time of its inception immediately becomes independent of the state So you as Finnish taxpayers lose all control overnight over the state-owned shares of Finnair. You might ask, why care? What is there to do? You've heard my colleague from Poland, and I'm sorry that I wasn't able to cheer you up with the situation in Hungary either. Well, one of the reasons why I think it's important to care is that we also care when someone in the family, even if it's a distant family member, has problems and is failing. At least we want to know what's the situation, if there is something we could do. And we are all members of the European family. The other reason why you should care is that Finnish taxpayers are funding this regime through EU funds. And also you should care because what happened to us can actually happen to you. And the reason I'm saying that is over the past couple of years, the Hungarian project, the liberal project, started to make its way to other EU countries and also outside of the European Union. What my colleague described that is happening at the Polish-Belarusian border is happening at the Hungarian-Serbian border since 2016, for over 5 years. These regimes are teaching each other, and teaching each other in a very effective way. And what I am asking you to do as a closing remark is actually what you can do to stop this illness from spreading in Europe. First of all, participate in public life and in public debate. Read and write and form an opinion, go to demonstrations if you like, speak to your elected representatives in the parliament, in the municipalities, but also in the European Parliament, and ask them, what are they doing when they meet their Hungarian or Polish counterparts? Do they raise these issues? Do they raise the very specific rule of law problems, the very specific corruption-related problems? Do they raise the very specific human rights violations in these countries? And if not, they should. And be vigilant. There are a lot of signs, and we will talk about these signs during the next session, that you should really consider when they are taking place in your country, be that in Finland or be that in other European countries, so that the illness is not spreading. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anders, very, very much, and thank you for sharing this ordinary day in the illiterate Hungary. In my ears, it sounds like a very absurd and scary day. And we will, as Anders told us, we will discuss these matters in the next session. And the next session, we will have a panel here with Anders, Eliza, and also with Tuomas. And we will also be joined by two politicians, Heidi Hautala, member of the European Parliament for the Greens, and also Johannes Koskinen, member of the Finnish Parliament for the Social Democrats. But we will continue with the panel next session in 10 minutes. So now we have a short break, 10-minute break, some coffee, and after that we will continue with the panel. So see you in 10 minutes. So welcome back with a short delay, but I hope you all had time to have coffee and maybe check your emails and so on. But now we are back and now we have a great panel here. We have Eliza and Andres and Tuomas that you already heard in earlier today. And we also have two new faces, but familiar faces at least in Finland. Heidi Hautala is a politician for the Greens. You are a member of the European Parliament and you have been in it for a long time. I think the first time you was elected was 1995.
Yeah, and then on and off I've been there.
On and off. And you are also now the vice president.
Yes.
In the European Parliament, and you also been a member of the Finnish Parliament and also a minister here in Finland. And we have Johannes Koskinen, also a very experienced politician. I think it was 1991.
Yes.
You were starting in the Finnish Parliament, and you have also been the Minister of Justice here in Finland.
Yeah.
Warm welcome to all of you. Okay. And we have about an hour plus time to discuss, and so we can discuss this matter from different perspectives. And but I will start to ask you, Heidi Hautala, because you know Brussels best of us. So you have been there last week. In the case of Poland and also in the case of Hungary, do you see that the Polish government now has some kind of crossed the last red line? Is this a decisive moment, a litmus test for EU? Will something happen now?
I think it is. Poland has crossed a red line. The question many of us have, what's the end game? What is this all leading to? Because in a way, by challenging the very core principles of the EU legal order, Poland has actually already stepped aside. And nevertheless, there is this dual message that we are a very European country, of course, and we want to stay, we're going to stay, and there's a strong support by the people of Poland. But I'm very puzzled about what will be next.
What do you think will be the next step?
Well, from the Parliament's point of view, first of all, we are now preparing a legal challenge against the Commission, because the EU Commission has not introduced this conditionality regulation, which makes it possible to withdraw certain funds from the country if there are serious and systematic failures in the judiciary and legal system. So that's one step in the process. But I do think that there are still hesitations among the member states about how this could be solved. There is sort of loose speech about finding a compromise. I don't know what that compromise would be, because I think the facts are quite clear that Poland is not adhering to EU legal order, in spite of the fact that it has adopted all of those as a member.
This is interesting that we now also see tensions between the institutions in EU. One could ask who runs the show in Brussels?
I would say that the Commission is a bit of a hostage of the member states. And the Parliament is, of course, pushing the Commission to be more proactive. And I must say, unfortunately, lately the attention has been very much on Poland and a bit less on Hungary at the moment, but not that the Parliament has forgotten. And may I say one thing, is that in the two countries, the ruling parties belong to two different political European families. Why, for instance, the Hungarian situation could sort of evolve with a little bit less attention is certainly that the ruling party Fidesz was so long as a member of the European People's Party, whereas in Poland the ruling party PiS is a member of the European Conservatives and Reformers, which is a smaller political group. So there's always this imbalance. You know, the political families tend to protect their own.
But EPP is not any longer a member of. Fidesz is
not anymore. But it took very, very long.
Yes, they were. Johannes Koskinen, how do you see the situation right now?
Well, maybe a background problem is that in the Treaty on European Union, it has not been written enough checks and balances, how to what to do when a certain member state is not behaving according to the great principles of the treaty. And maybe 20 years ago we couldn't imagine that there might be that kind of problems. The experience of the integration process has been positive in the sense that in these new member states, during the harmonization process and during the negotiations, great reforms were made, and maybe most of us thought that it's a one-way street and there wouldn't be backlashes, but now the reality shows that there are those, and now we have to create these efficient sanction mechanisms into the treaties and also into the fund mechanisms of the Union. And this is kind of a 11th hour that this new conditionality mechanism to the EU funds has been added, and now it's important to start the application of the implementation over that very strictly, so that it will be used. And I agree with the Parliament that it should be started at once, and to have a kind of a steady sanction mechanism which brings added value to this kind of a lacuna in the treaty, that these methods how to have member states back on the right track on rule of law issues, that what is needed so can be created through this mechanism.
Tuomas Ojanen, as a professor of law, would you say that the EU have the right tools to handle a member state that are not questioning the core values of EU, for example?
Well, from my perspective, EU treaties include a number of legal tools, but the problem area is more insofar as politics is concerned. But I would like to get back to your early question regarding whether Poland has crossed some red line, and my answer is yes, and this was not even the first time. This is actually a further step in a route that Poland has already taken previously. Just one day before this judgment by the Polish Constitutional Tribunal came out, the European Court of Justice had issued this statement that it won't accept this Poland's request to cancel its injunction ordering the member state to suspend the recently established disciplinary regime for judges, and that was also one of the measures adopted by Poland that crossed the red line. Now, in this recent judgment by the Polish Constitutional Tribunal, the tribunal is actually challenging the very foundations of EU law, not only insofar as primacy of EU law over conflicting national law is concerned, but also the very foundations of what EU membership is all about. It's challenging Articles 1, 4 and 19 of the Treaty on the European Union, and these articles are about defining what EU membership is all about, what the distribution of competencies between the EU and its member states is all about, and what the judicial system of the European Union is all about. So, from legal perspective, it seems that, if I simplify a bit, what perhaps is the only valid article in the EU treaties at the moment from the perspective of the Polish tribunal is Article 50, which is about withdrawal from the European Union.
Will there be a Polexit?
Well, legally speaking, as a lawyer, I have to be very formalistic about it. And speaking from that perspective, we have not notified of we have not sent a notification that we will be withdrawing. But are we still within the EU if our government openly denies the interim measures, openly rejects judgments of the ECJ that they do not agree with? That's the moment when you leave an organization, really, when you stop playing by the rules. When we entered the EU in 2004, we complied with the Copenhagen criteria. at this moment in time, Poland would not be admitted into the EU. That is something that has to be very clearly said at this point. We did not match, we did not pass the Copenhagen criteria due to the destruction of specifically the judicial system. My worry through all of this is not a Pol exit or a Hun exit. It's forcing a redefinition of the EU by these states. What we have been trying to convey, the message that we have been trying to convey during our stay here, is that populists learn from each other. And we have no guarantee which EU member state will be next on its path to a populistic government. If Poland will not be stopped efficiently in its tracks right now, the EU values will become redefined. And this is actually in line with a more severe issue of redefining a lot of human rights values that we have thought we were all agreed on. So this is a part of a bigger agenda. So my worry is not a Pol exit or a Hun exit. It's a change of what the EU stands for and a change of what the EU is. And my fear is that we will be forced back a couple of decades back to when the EU was simply an economic equation. And that is what we are fighting to avoid.
But let me get back to the paradox of Poland, because I remember when I did some stories in Poland trying to explain that how is it possible that they support this government who is doing this to the core values, and at the same time there's a huge support for EU in Poland. And that's kind of paradox. It's hard to understand. I remember I met a family with many children. They were very happy because they liked the peace government because of the 500 zloty child benefit. And they said that they are helping their 6-7 children with a lot of hobbies. But they also liked EU. They felt like EU like the EU membership. So this is sometimes quite difficult to understand for us here, that how is it possible that you same time support the government and EU?
This government has done a lot to create a very effective, strange narrative, which at the same time draws a lot of financial, financial values from the EU, but at the same time rejects the European values as they stand in the treaties, for example, and conveys them as foreign to Polish values. So they have actually managed to convince a lot of the Polish people that at the same time they should be happy with being within the EU because they get funding, but at the same time they should oppose the European values that are foreign to what they have known and cared for. The thing that the Polish government is not doing is explaining that in fact Polish values and European values are compliant with each other. If you go through the Polish constitution and the EU treaties, you will see the same words used to convey, for example, the importance of the independence of the courts. So all this is to say that the Polish public has fallen victim to a very, very twisted narrative of the government.
Heli.
If we now sort of take both Hungary and Poland to the same picture, I think Elisa said in her presentation earlier today that the political agenda overruled human dignity. And I believe this is very much on the topic now. For instance, the European Parliament will adopt very soon a resolution 1 year after this very strict anti-abortion law of I think 20th of October 2020, where we, of course, call for this type of sexual and reproductive rights to be returned to Polish citizens, Polish women. But also we raise all these concerns about the broader picture. But the narrative is that it's traditional values, it's so-called family, whatever that means. In this case, it means a very traditional family, and national, let's say, consensus Then we have this whole discussion on women's rights. We have the Polish exit from the Istanbul Convention, and I think the same narrative is in Hungary, but not only in Hungary and in Poland. You have the same narrative creeping into politics in a very large number of particularly Central and Eastern European member states. But then outside also, Turkey is a primary example. So there's something which is at the political level going sort of beyond the legal issue, but the legal issue is really crucial, as we have now heard, that it's really EU's fundamental values and rights are at stake.
And Anders, Mr. Orban and Fidesz has been in power for over a decade now. I still have a big support, especially in the countryside, right?
Well, when it comes to big support, it's a question of definition. At the previous election, Fidesz actually received less than 50% of the votes. But because of the gerrymandered, distorted election system introduced by Fidesz in 2014, this translated into more than 2/3 seats in parliament. So with less than 50% of the votes, because of the way the system is created, they are able to change the constitution without the votes of any other member of parliament. So I think, first of all, there is a myth that there is such a huge support for these policies. Second, the reasons, I think there are key differences between Hungary and Poland. One of them is I very much disagree with the portrayal of Hungary as a conservative, or the Hungarian regime as a conservative regime. I think it's an extremely cynical regime in the sense that it has very few values to which it truly adheres to. It's not a question of a traditional political debate between conservatives and liberals and social democrats and Greens. Many of the policies that were introduced recently, the exact opposite were introduced a couple of years ago by the very same government. It's always a question of political narratives and successful communication campaigns. And why these campaigns are successful, and that's also a difference between Poland and Hungary, is that, as I said in my introduction, about half of the Hungarian media was eaten up by a propaganda machine. And I've been told by some Finnish friends previously that I shouldn't use this term in Finland, propaganda machinery, because people will think that I'm exaggerating the situation. And I just want to give you one very striking example. We have public media in Hungary as well, which is fully occupied by government figures. What you are hearing in the public media is actually the opinion of the governing party. Opposition politicians, civil society figures, ordinary citizens are not able to get even 5 seconds on the public media. There are no political discussions. There are no political debates in the public media. And on top of this, you have 500 individual media outlets that over the past decade were bought up by oligarchs close to the government and the prime minister. And suddenly, I mean, that's another beautiful absurdity of the system. 2 years ago, one morning, all of these oligarchs woke up to the same idea, that they will just give it away as a gift, the media outlets, to a newly established foundation. And now there is a foundation that owns 500 media outlets, TV stations, radio stations, print media, online media. All of these media are edited in one central editorial board. If this is not Orwell 1984, then I don't know what is. And the vast majority of the population actually is able only to read these print newspapers, because they include all regional papers, is watching the public media, listens to the public radio, or the radio stations that are owned by this foundation. It is a very strange thing in any pluralistic democracy, but try to imagine that for a decade you receive only one kind of information which is never questioned, against which no other facts reach you. Then that becomes your reality. So during election campaigns, not Finland, but for example, 3 years ago, Sweden, your neighboring country, for very clear political reasons, because the Swedish government was criticizing the Hungarian government very loudly. For weeks during the election campaign, there were reports about how horrible and insecure it is to live in Sweden. It's a living hell, nobody's secure, everyone's afraid, terrorism on the rise, and people are going to become refugees and will come to Hungary, who will embrace all these tens of thousands of Swedish refugees flocking to Hungary, and that becomes the reality.
Johannes Koskinen, you're a member of the Social Democratic Party, the ruling party in Finland. How can we here in Finland and the government in Finland tolerate this kind of reality in other member states in EU?
The ways how to influence are, of course, a bit difficult. We notice these kinds of problems, but we don't have the straight powers, only through these international organizations, Council of Europe, EU especially. And some of these phenomena are also familiar from longer term member states, like Italy during Berlusconi's time. They had almost the same kind of media powers, like you know, in Hungary. And also those kind of failures inside the constitutional system, we have that kind of also, like in Greece and Italy, there are these election rules that make the governing party stronger than it actually proportionally is. So they get these extra seats, and it has been amended to the constitution so to have a stronger government when we have 10 or 15 parties in the parliament. But now these cases of both Poland and Hungary show that these kinds of power-supporting exceptions from the proportionality principles are dangerous. But then if there is somebody very willing to use power for a long time, added with corruption and this media presence, so that might bring great failure to the democratic system. And actually, I just remembered I was visiting Poland almost 20 years ago when these accession negotiations were going on, and I visited the Polish justice minister and discussing of their system. And already then we pointed out this problem that the justice minister is at the same time general prosecutor. But they explained very strongly that because United States has the same kind of systems, there's no problem for the division of powers, kind of, or the independence of the prosecution system or the judiciary. But now we know that there is a danger coming with that kind of systems. And I think what is needed is a very simultaneous process by the Council of Europe, the Venice Commission, the Human Rights Court and also European Court of Justice. And EU, of course, is the main actor because we have this kind of financial power which can have more conditionality, and these kind of narrow legal possibilities by EU and partly member states must be used to have a correction to this.
But the Commission is the guardian of the treaty. We know the EP have talked about this for years, but it seems that the problem is amongst the member states. That, of course, there are this veto with Hungary and Poland supporting each other, but we have also seen that, for example, the French President Macron has a quite low profile in this. I think last week Marine Le Pen was visiting Orban. Maybe it has something to do with the presidential elections coming up. Angela Merkel is a lame duck. How do you see it from your perspective? How the member states are what they are doing? Are they really doing something?
Well,
If you could,
very quickly, sure. Yes, there are member states who have been quite vocal about these negative trends over the past couple of years, and actually the Finnish government is one of those governments. And then you have a number of member states which are much less vocal. And I mean, I'm definitely not the right person to explain why, for example, Germany is regularly looking away when these problems are discussed in public at the European Parliament, in the Council. But that is definitely a problem. And why it is a problem is exactly what Eliza was already mentioning, that these regimes are slowly eating up the European project from the inside. So with a system where each member state has a veto power over, for example, a foreign policy decision, this can become very, very problematic. And it takes time, I think, for many member states to actually grasp the level of, or the gravity of the situation. And I think we are getting there. So I have been doing my job at the Hungarian Helsinki Committee for almost 7 years now, and I can see in that sense, the positive development that 5 years ago, everybody was surprised about these things, and now people are actually much more aware of the situation, which is, I know it takes a lot of time, but trust me when I say it is actually already a very positive change.
The thing that I would like to mention in here is that I have the feeling that for a long time, countries such as Poland were treated like these, special countries that needed some push to, reach the Western Europe and its values and its development, and we were always catching up a little bit. My appeal to the old EU countries is always stop helping us, start holding us accountable to the standards of the EU. This Polish government has actually been abusing its stance as the new democracy that has joined the EU. Why is Germany looking away? Also for historical reasons. And I'm not afraid to say it. And I know that Germany has been a huge champion for us, and I thank them for it, for including us in the European project, and I know that they have been huge advocates for us. But right now is the moment to hold us accountable. We have been treated as, the child of the EU, but we have caught up. And the EU cannot let this government abuse its stand right now. That would be my answer to it. And also just going off of the point regarding the Prosecutor General in Poland, we have actually taken steps to change that. Right before Law and Justice took over power, the Minister of Justice and the Prosecutor General's positions were separated. The first move that they made after they took over power, they joined them back up again.
Last week after the European Council, I think it was the online paper Politico wrote, according to the sources, there's a dirty, so secret truth about the EU's fight with Poland over the rule of law that almost no one in the EU institutions wants to admit aloud. It's unwinnable. That EU won't go to war with its own member states because the whole entire agenda will be basically blocked. It's a lot of politics in this, even if this is also a legal matter. How do you see it? for example, Tuomas? Is the politics or is it?
As you said, there is so much politics at the moment going on as well. But from the perspective of law, I would just want to emphasize that although this seminar is now focusing on erosion of the rule of law, this is also something entailing erosion of human rights, erosion of democracy. So it's not only a problem of the EU and its member states, it's also a problem of the Council of Europe and its contracting parties. Earlier today I emphasized the close relationship between the rule of law and human rights. And what we are seeing going on in Poland and Hungary, it's also very worrying from the perspective of the European Human Rights Convention, several other human rights treaties. When the independence of the courts is being attacked, it's something very problematic, actually, violation of Article 6 of the European Human Rights Convention enshrining the right to a fair trial. What we are seeing is also very worrying from the perspective of freedom of expression, explicitly protected by Article 10 of the European Human Rights Convention and so on and so forth. So this is a wider problem, also a problem from the perspective of human rights and democracy, not only rule of law, they are closely interrelated. But what can be done? At the end of the day, I'm afraid that this is not something that can be fixed through legal mechanisms. I'm inclined to think that money talks.
Let's talk about that a little bit later, Heidi.
Yeah, let's talk about it because it's all about money.
Yeah.
You know, it's a kind of a kleptocratic state capture that we're talking about. I think there are differences between Hungary and Poland and some other countries, but I still do believe that this sort of reluctance by a large number of EU member states to sort of use the means that we have, legal means, is short-sighted because referring to our earlier discussions just a moment ago, I think many of us concluded that now we are really at the core of the EU, its existential issue for the EU, because if we don't have the legal order, then it means that we become a kind of a Eurasian economic union, which has even a court in Minsk, capital of Belarus. Does anyone believe that it's a real court? We don't want that. We want something different. So I think it's very short-sighted not to use the means that we have. And I believe that, for instance, the Commission's President, Ursula von der Leyen, in her speech, she made her best speech ever last week. She said that there are three things we can do, that we have to be tough on these infringement procedures. And Tuomas already explained how it works. Poland, by the way, now has to pay, I think, €1 million a day. But it's small money because, if the national pride is at stake, you can pay any price, I guess. And the second is this conditionality of the recovery fund and the budget, which now I think it's a little bit suspended because obviously there was a decision last week in the European Council that the Council will wait for the ruling of the European Court of Justice about the compliance of this mechanism with EU law. Tuomas can explain better. And the third is this Article 7.
The nuclear
process.
option.
But as Andreas said, actually the Finnish government was very instrumental in relaunching this dialogue with I guess it was Hungary and Poland in December 2019 during the Finnish presidency. I hope I count the years right. So there are three different legal issues that should be then followed, because otherwise I think we are sort of maybe winning. Well, how shall I say? We will postpone the issue, and then we will have to sacrifice something much bigger.
Or postpone it until we have a new government in Hungary or a new government in Poland.
Is there a chance in Hungary and Poland to repair anything through elections? That I would be very curious to hear from our guests.
If we can have that question a little bit later, because we also have a question from Juliana Brandt. Is Juliana Brandt with us? Juliana is a youth and she has been part of this project, that this webinar is also part of this project. And Juliana has a question to the panel. Let's see if we will get Juliana in. You can see her at the screen. Hi, Juliana.
Can you hear and see me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay, yeah, thank you. So I would like to ask one question on behalf of myself and one question on behalf of Dimitri Lindgren, who is a Romani activist. Dimitri has some Teams connection problems, so I would take the task of taking his questions also. But I would first ask my own question. So hello everyone, I'm Juliana Brandt. I'm identifying as activist, especially in the human rights field, and especially I identify as disability activists and also LGBTQI+ activist. And today my question is about LGBTQI+ community, especially in Poland and Hungary. And I work in the mental health field, so I would like to connect mental health, rights and justice and being part of the LGBTQI+ community. So yeah, this being said, my question is, how you all see that the others EU countries also have responsibility of support and support especially LGBTQI+ communities in Poland and in Hungary, because we all know that our LGBTQI+ people's mental health has been very hard time now. We have struggled a lot. Our suicide thoughts have been rising in those countries because of the law that discriminates us. So I would like to ask how, especially, for example, Finland feels also responsible of this situation and other EU countries, because like we all know, as EU citizens, we are in this together and it's our common problem to solve, that some of our communities are feeling so much struggle of who they are and how they would like to be seen. But there's no room for that right now in Poland and Hungary. So yeah, I would like to start discussion of the mental health problems and how to support our communities in Poland and Hungary.
Thank you. We can maybe have an answer here. And you mentioned in your introduction earlier today.
Well, thank you so much, Juliana. And
Thank you.
actually what you are doing, that is what you should do, to pay attention on what's happening there and raise these issues. The other thing that I find very valuable is the show of solidarity, not just online, but also, should the pandemic allow, to actually come and visit us in Hungary. And come and join us during the Pride Parade, for example, especially a Pride Parade in the countryside, not in Budapest. The other thing that you can do, and I think what would be very valuable from a mental health perspective, is that the Hungarian law specifically prohibits any kind of discussion of LGBT issues with children under 18. Which means that if there is a kid in school who thinks that they might belong to the LGBT community, they don't know how to approach their teacher, for example, because the teacher doesn't know if they can have a discussion. So this is a very serious mental health problem indeed. And you can offer, for example, hours to talk, not to counsel, but just to talk to your peers in Hungary, at least those who speak English, so that they can ask questions from you, because of course you would not be persecuted by the Hungarian legislation. So that's also that. And lastly, there are Hungarian organizations and activists, LGBT organizations and activists, who really need all the support that you can give. And it's not just financial support, it's also moral support. So do Google them and just drop them a message on Facebook or email. And I know very much from my own personal experience how much it actually means emotionally that there is someone from another country who just lets you know that, hey, you are fighting the good fight and I'm here watching what's happening to you. So thank you so much for your attention and keep it up.
Thank you. Thank you for the answer.
So just to build on what Andras just said, well, the case of the LGBTI community in Poland is not a happy one. Today is actually a very special day because it's called Rainbow Friday. And typically you would have discussions concerning the LGBTI QA plus communities in schools, so that kids and youths would be able to discuss these subjects. It's also a sort of visibility day for them at their own school. However, due to the fact that we have a homophobic Minister of Education, we know for a fact that any school that organizes a Rainbow Friday openly will possibly face some kind of persecution by the educational board. So what I would suggest is that if it is within your power, if it is within your capabilities, to organize even webinars for Swedish kids in lieu of all the schools in Poland that can't do it openly. And also, like Andras said, drop them a message that you have done so. Another thing, this is a bigger scale solution, and that would mostly be, me addressing, for example, the Finnish government and the Finnish, your parliamentarians, etc., to not let go of these questions, to keep questioning the Polish government on these issues, because human rights are enshrined in the EU treaties. And like you rightfully said, this is not an issue of the community solely in Poland. We should be treating the entirety of the EU as one community. So we cannot separate ourselves from each other. Yeah. So I would say, I would come in that way. Thank you for your question, though. It's very good.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juliana.
Yeah, and I would like to address one little thing, that I would really hope that people could be our allies, when you are not part of the LGBTQI+ community, so you are not marginalized groups like we are. I would really put the focus and the power to you also, because we need you, we need everyone in this fight for our rights. And sometimes when it comes to our own identity and traumas and mental health, it's too much struggle and we are so tired of fighting. So that's why I'm also giving the responsible for those who are not part of our community and facing those traumas. So yeah, that I would like to add on my speech also with this question. And yeah, like I earlier said, Dimitri Lindgren, Romani activist, had some Teams connection problems. So I would take his question now. So on behalf of Dimitri Lindgren, Romani activist, I would like to ask especially Romani questions and Romani situation in Poland and Hungary. So how has the situation of Romani communities in Poland and Hungary developed? And how can the EU guarantee the rights of the Romani people?
Thank you very much, Juliana.
Thank
You want to
you.
start?
So it would deserve, and I'm not joking, an entire webinar on its own. The situation of the Roma population in Hungary, which consists of about 10% of the population. We don't have exact figures. For historical reasons, there is no ethnic data collection in Hungary, but that's an estimate about 10% of the population. Over the past couple of years, of course, one of the biggest, most serious problem that the community has been facing for a long time is educational segregation. A decade-old practice in Hungary is to announce that children belonging to the Roma community are actually disabled children, so they have to be taught separately from healthy children, which in practice is an ethnic separation. Special classes created for students who are supposedly mentally disabled, but in fact they are only Roma children. This issue is part actually of an infringement procedure that is in its sleeping mode with the Commission. But what is very important, and again relates and shows how you're so right about how human rights and rule of law are strongly related. There was one very brave community of Roma children in Hungary who actually stood up against this with the help of an NGO, and they sought financial compensation for the years-long segregation and very low quality of education they received in the segregated classes. And the lawsuit went on for years, and in the end, even the Supreme Court in Hungary ruled that it was not only segregation, but the children are entitled to compensation because it infringed their right to education. And the government didn't want to pay the compensation to these children, and the Prime Minister used the terms, there is no free money. So why should we pay for these people who are now young adults? There is no payment without work. And of course it had a horrific undertone. And then what happened was, in the end, the government did pay those very specific children that very specific compensation, and immediately changed the legislation so that in no future cases can anybody sue for compensation in segregation cases. And at the same time, didn't address the core problem, segregation. So you have these kind of overriding or overruling court decisions in Hungary. That's also a tactic that even if in one particular case you win a victory, they make sure that in the future no such cases can ever get to court.
So the difference with us is that Poland is a extremely homogeneous country. If we look at our ethnical structure. However, we do know that we do have a minority of the Romani people as well. We don't have exact numbers. And in theory, our constitution guarantees equal access to education. In theory, it guarantees equal access to healthcare. In theory, we are a democratic state of law. In practice, we are looking at a situation where we're not quite sure how big the Romani minority is. We are not sure as to exactly in what conditions all of the Romani people live in Poland right now. A lot of them are somehow out of the system, so not included, for example, in the healthcare system. So all of this is to say that also the pandemic really highlighted the issue. So whenever the schools went on to teach via Zoom or via Google Meets, It turned out that a lot of these groups, they did not have access to a computer or to the internet or to electricity even. So all in all, unfortunately, I cannot be any more positive in my message concerning the state. But of course, in theory, the Polish state cannot discriminate against anyone because of their ethnicity.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Juliana and Dimitri, for
Thank
these
you.
questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And these are subjects that we, as a consumer, I don't really find any articles or stories in the European papers of these topics. And another topic that you don't read about so much anymore is the border issue, the refugee issue that you both mentioned in your presentation. We know that the Belarus border now is something that you can't really go as a journalist and report there because you don't have access there. I have been several times in the Serbian-Hungarian border. But shortly, can you tell me what's happening there? Because this is a huge problem for EU that we have police and we have people treating these refugees and immigrants this way, but no one is really talking about it.
The Hungarian government has been using the refugee issue as a laboratory for its illiberal policies and legislation. And the reason why for so long this was kept under the radar is because it became such a highly contested, extremely sensitive, if you like, toxic political issue, not just in Hungary, but also in Europe. One of the things that I mentioned in my speech is the pushbacks that take place from Hungary to Serbia. Again, this is a measure that was legalized in Hungarian domestic law. This is not an option, this is the obligation of the police officer. You cannot ask for asylum in Hungary since May 2020. The law makes it impossible for anyone to seek asylum in Hungary. There are infringement procedures. There is actually already a judgment of the Court of Justice of the EU finding the Hungarian pushback law to be in breach of EU law. Hungary is not implementing the judgment. The Hungarian Minister of Justice earlier this year pulled the Polish card, as I usually say it, arguing that that judgment is in breach of the Hungarian constitution, so it should not be implemented. And many of these issues are flying under the radar because of the sensitivity of the topic. But it is actually awful. I'm partly responsible for documenting the cases of pushbacks and violent pushbacks from Hungary to Serbia. And I also want to say that what's happening there is not only a very serious human rights concern, which should be enough in itself to act, but what's a very grave security concern and should be seen as such by European decision makers is that pushbacks take place in a way that nobody knows who these people are. And it is very likely that the Hungarian police is removing people from the Schengen zone who are actually wanted by the Finnish or the French or the Polish or the Austrian authorities because there is no registration, no identification. It's like a Swiss cheese, the Hungarian border in that sense. What it does is that it sacrifices security and human rights at the altar of anti-migration narratives.
These human rights breaches, is it a topic in the Finnish parliament right now? The refugee question, the EU border question?
Yes, it is coming up every now and then when we find new problems, or it's in Lithuania or Poland or any other frontier state of EU. And of course, these are more kind of central problems in a country like Hungary, when the kind of a populistic attitude of the people, of the government tries to win political support for their kind of anti-migration policies. one issue is that this accountability of EU funds and how they are used is a kind of a long-term problem that especially this we got extra expenditure for Roma minorities in many EU countries. So after a few years it can be said that there is no positive influence by that. So it's a more general problem that these huge EU funds, their kind of results are not efficiently enough monitored by the institutions. The accountability is lacking, and that is very problematic when it comes to these very vulnerable minorities, and they are not getting what is decided to belong to them.
I just wanted to add on to the question of the border, because I feel like this is extremely crucial, especially concerning what is going on in Poland right now. And I really want to appeal to the European politicians especially. If anybody hears this, they should not look away. I know this is a sensitive topic, as Andras said. I know nobody wants to bring up the questions back from 2015 and be considered, the person who wants to open up the borders, or however that is called. But right now, this is a humanitarian crisis. I'm coming from a country where we have people dying in the woods on their own after being driven out there into those woods by European border guards. The situation at the Polish border deteriorated over 2 months, 3 months now. It's what I call a legal cascade. Why do I call it a legal cascade? Firstly, when the crisis started, we were able to go there. We were able to help those people. We were able to actually interact with them even. And according to the Polish law, the guards have the obligation to accept motions for asylum, to file them, and to process them later on. However, the government decided to use the lowest ranking technical legal act you can use and actually allow for pushbacks using that technical legal act. Since that was questioned by lawyers, the government then came in to the idea to introduce a state of emergency, to push out all the human rights lawyers, all the human rights activists, and all the media away from the border. And what has it done later on? It actually amended the legal acts concerning asylum seekers to legalize pushbacks. This was all done contrary to the Geneva Convention, contrary to the procedural directive. We are looking at a breaking of EU law under the EU law's eye. So this is a really clear example of the degradation of the rule of law in relation to human rights guarantees. And this should be well seen and should be well presented in the media, in the European media, because we cannot have people dying on our borders.
May I just say that on the 7th of October, the European Parliament adopted a resolution on Belarus. And unfortunately, it was impossible to vote in favor of that resolution, because what really sort of stood out, and this is picked by Russian news agency, interestingly, is that the European Parliament at the end called for very strong solidarity with Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania, and accepting more or less what is happening there. So calling for a stronger border, protection of external borders, and strong solidarity with the 3 EU countries that are now recipients of these refugees. So that was not in the honor of our institution, that I can say.
We could surely have a webinar about the border question and about how badly or poorly EU is handling these refugee questions. But we have about 15-20 minutes left. And I want to talk about actually 2 topics that we have already really discussed, but I want to go more deeper into that before we have to draw a line and end this webinar. But first we take a question from the chat. And you can see how do the panelists see the potential of Article 7 procedure against Poland and Hungary? And Article 7 is the most powerful tool that the EU has in the treaty, when it's also kind of a difficult tool to use. Tuomas?
Unfortunately, I cannot see so much potential through Article 7, simply because the European Council has to act by unanimity. And to my knowledge, either Poland or Hungary, they have already announced that if some...
For many years ago already.
Yeah. But I just wish to lift into attention that infringement procedure is not something for the European Commission only to launch it, but Article 259 also allows for the member states to bring infringement procedure before the European Court of Justice if they are of the view that a certain member state is in violation of EU law or its obligations under EU membership. So I would actually like to think that if Commission is making a claim before the European Court of Justice under this infringement procedure, why not other member states, such as Finland, for instance, Sweden, Germany, or whatever, they would also join this claim, so as to support and making a clear sign that they are supporting the Commission and they are also worried about the very fundamental values of the European Union.
And we have been discussing the Article 7 for many years. For example, in Poland, do people really think that the EU will react this time?
Well, there has been hope like 3 years ago, but now we are after 6 years of this regime, and we are still like stuck. But to be quite serious about the issue, no, we do not, exactly for the reason that was just mentioned previously. And again, it is very problematic in the sense that it would be the country who would really be held responsible for the actions of its government. I always repeat that the actions taken by the EU have to be very clearly aimed at what the government is doing and not against the country. Because it's, and in the end, really it's the Polish citizens who are most at stake due to the lack of independent courts, due to whatever the government is doing. We are the ones stuck with them.
The same is with the money question as well, that we have been discussing earlier, that of course...
If I could link to that question. So what I always say is that the mechanisms surrounding all EU funding should make it impossible for governments to deny their own citizens within their own discretion on who gets the money later on. So the mechanisms that would allow, for example, for the civil society to actually be able to win some grants, somehow access that money without the kind of going through its own government, because we know how that will end. Just to give you a very clear example, during the discussion over the ratification of the recovery fund in Poland, there was a very strong stance by the opposition parties to actually create an agenda that would kind of be the surveillance over how the money would be divided. The government was very much against it, and it did not pass. So that is all to say, the mechanisms now have to include citizens more than the governments.
Look, I'm sorry to say, but I disagree on the usefulness of the Article 7 procedure. And I disagree because that's definitely the case that Poland would veto the recommendations against Hungary and vice versa. But the very fact that once a year at least, European member states, heads of government, have to sit down in a room and ask a number of questions to your and to my government about what's happening in the judiciary, what's happening on the field of human rights, in the media, with refugees and so on. And there has to be answers given. Is, I think, a very important development. And I know that around every Article 7 hearing, there hasn't been a lot. The governments try to show the best of their faces in that sense. So, yes, I'm skeptical about the outcome, but as a process to discuss, to ask questions, to put these problems to the center of discussion, even if it's just for half an hour, I think it's very important. As with infringement procedures, I absolutely agree. I think what is a general problem here is that infringement procedures tend to be extremely surgical and technical and very boring. I could sit here and nobody would listen about the current ones. And if you have an entire system that is built for the purpose of dismantling the rule of law, then these kind of individual surgical interventions are not really going to address anything, especially taking into account that they take 4 or 5 years. By the time there is a decision, there are 10 new problems. So lastly, that's why I was smiling when you brought up the example of the prosecutor's office in Poland, because, I mean, come on, in Hungary, there is an independent prosecutor's office, and that independent prosecutor is an ex-candidate of a member of parliament of Fidesz, and surprisingly, there are no corruption cases investigated. And on paper, it is an independent institution. So it's not just institutions and legal terms and stuff, it's the entire picture. And currently, no infringement procedure is undergoing against any of these countries which looks at this problem holistically.
Interesting and scary as well. But Johannes, are you as a Finnish politician and the Social Democratic Party, is the Social Democratic Party ready to stop the money and the lack of money could maybe change the situation? Do you think this is an answer to this?
Yes, I think it has been widely accepted that that is the maybe only effective way of having a say in what's happening in a member state. If it's too negative from the general point of view of the union, so we have to use this sanction. And then these new methods like this reporting of rule of law development is important, that we have more facts, data, what is going on, and then we have this legitimation for using financial tools. And then, but there, like Thomas has said about these political problems, that when we try to use these financial sanctions, so then many other member states think that the next day it's us who are losing. So there you especially have this political problem connected with the kind of a very narrow legal possibilities that we have in the treaties. But together, when we have more information, these problems, I would also stress this importance of anti-corruption work at the same time, because these are usually corrupted systems when you have this kind of concentrated powers. So these methods and the publicity together make it a kind of a efficient political tool that also the knowledge of the people in those affected countries gets better, and then we have the possibility both through these legal and financial methods, but also through democratic elections of change.
This is a very interesting discussion and a complex matter, and the time flies. We just have some minutes left, but I want to end this by a little bit looking into the future. And if I start in Hungary, you have an election in next April, right? And there are for sure some Europeans hoping for a new government, and then we could solve maybe some of the questions. And even the opposition has a candidate now. How do you see? Will this candidate really give Mr. Orban a match? Or is this a solution for this?
Look, I'm not a political analyst, so it's not really my
But what's your guess?
But
Short guess.
I think the problem here, or the real dilemma here, will be how do you dismantle or work with a legal system that is so problematic, that is created with a 2/3 majority, and in order to change practically anything in the system, you have to have a 2/3 majority. And that's also, I think, a very interesting legal theoretical question, a constitutional dilemma. There are very exciting debates about this currently in Hungary happening, but if the opposition wins next spring, I think this will be the first huge issue to tackle, and I'm sure that in that case you will hear a lot about the Hungarian legal framework and this and that institution.
And how is the Polish case? Donald Tusk have made a comeback in Poland, but he's not that popular back home.
Being as I'm not a politician, I'm a lawyer, and as a lawyer, as an objective lawyer, I will tell you this. Firstly, you have to have a free election. And we're at a point now where the chamber in the Supreme Court that actually states whether or not the elections were done in a correct manner and are valid is seated with new nominees, coming from the NEO National Council of the Judiciary that was actually kicked out from the European network of the Council of the Judiciary yesterday. Which, of course, was the only possible outcome, seeing as that network is of national councils of the judiciary and not of political nominees. That being said, we need to have independent monitoring missions. The ODIHR report from last year was a report that clearly stated the discrepancies, the inequality of the coverage, for example, in the public media regarding the presidential candidates. So that being said, we need the free elections. What's coming afterwards? Because we are Democrats, because we want to comply with the rule of law standards, all the changes would have to be respectful towards democratic standards. So you can't just go in with a scalpel and just cut everything off, throw everyone out with one move. You would have to go through all the procedures that we would have to set up, firstly. The second to last thing I want to mention is that there is Article 44 of our Polish Constitution, which states clearly that all criminal proceedings that were stalled because of political reasons will be unstalled after those political reasons cease. So I see a lot of criminal proceedings in Poland in the future. And the last thing being said is that I really do hope that all those who are now breaking the law will be happy to say that we still believe in the right to defense and fair trial.
And I will give the really last words I will ask Heidi, because you follow this from Brussels. Rest of us sitting here in Helsinki or in Budapest or Warsaw.
Well,
how do you see the future? Will it?
Well, two things. I think a lot has been said about the need of solidarity with human rights activists and lawyers and people who are now under pressure and political criminalization and things like that. So, and the European Parliament is always there. I mean, we are always sending people, or people are going because they feel that need. And last week we've had women's activists in the European Parliament. Great discussions and a resolution coming up next week. Secondly, I would like to say that We have to be attentive when we listen to what's going on and what has been evolving in Poland and Hungary, because there was Kari Kuusiniemi made this initiative in Finland last spring, where he said that even in Finland, if there would be a kind of a political majority who would want to abolish some key elements in our legal order, our constitutional order, they could do it with simple majority. And I think there's now a discussion on maybe even some sort of project to see how to prevent such things happening in the future. I mean, we are obviously not talking about the government where the party of Johannes Koskinen and myself and a few others are. But in the future, it is not excluded that a country that believes that it is really a deep rule of law state respecting human rights and whatnot. So it could happen.
That's a good point to end this discussion with. We shouldn't take it for granted, not even here in Finland. A big thank you to all of you, Johannes, Andres, and Elisa, and Heidi, and also Tuomas. We had a great discussion. But as it usually is, the time flies. We could continue for another hour, but let's do it another time. But thank you especially for you to coming here to Helsinki and share your stories. And now we will soon end this webinar. But before that, I will give the closing words or the word to Kari Mattila, who will close this webinar. And Kari, you are the Secretary General for the Finnish League of Human Rights. Kari.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and also dear participants, dear speakers. Thank you for being with us. Today you have been about 125 people to our knowledge. And thank you also for interpreters, for Roast Agency, for facilitating this meeting, and also for my own colleagues, especially Kerttu Villamo and Reetta Helander, as it always takes a lot of work to have such a valuable group here, and all of you in the other side of the screen. Thank you. We have heard devastating news. Some of them were new, some were old, about blatant violations of human rights in Poland and Hungary, and also about the erosion and of the EU's core values, and also total disregard towards them in some of the member states. I think we have been angered, but we have also been touched. And I hope, to some extent at least, we have been empowered by all of you speaking here today, also including Juliana and Dimitri, who made questions, and other people asking in the chat. Before the webinar today, we looked at the list of the participants, and we were delighted to see that people from very diverse backgrounds are with us today. There are many students, teachers, researchers, professors, but there are also many of you who are from different governmental authorities, from Finland, but also some other countries. From the Office of the Chancellor of Justice to Foreign Ministry, from the National Human Rights Center to Environmental Ministry. And I think it is actually of utmost importance that different authorities in the EU member states, which are democratic, not only foreign ministries or EU affairs people, listen to and learn from the Polish and Hungarian civil society about what is really going on, as we have heard today. It's not enough to listen to government's official statements in official meetings. Dialogue and diplomacy, obviously, with any government are important for governments, but one has to be careful in choosing the channels of information or broadening the channels of information. Since the governments of Poland and Hungary do not do it, we here must give space for civil society of Hungary and Poland, not only as a token, but in genuine and in creative ways. This also might mean that one has to find new avenues and maybe new funding channels for signs of solidarity, for signs of support. If not now, then when? And I call upon all of you on behalf of us organizers, the Finnish League of Human Rights, but I also call upon those of you, especially in positions of power, who are with us today, in your relevant institutions and roles to raise awareness and also to take action to stop the erosion of rule of law, the attack on democracy and on human rights in your respective positions. This also concerns doing what we can do in Finland, a stronghold of democratic rule. As a seemingly small but a potentially very relevant measure, I think Finland could easily double or triple or more its efforts to train governmental and local authorities in human rights and in the rule of law, how it actually functions. What we heard from Professor Tuomas Ojennan, but also from our colleagues from Poland and Hungary, the elements of rule of law, people don't actually understand them very well because I guess we thought that it's not necessary. It's there, the state of rule of law, democracy, human rights prevails, but that is not the case as we have eloquently heard today. How are we supposed to defend the rule of law and human rights if we don't know what they are? Even government officials, citizens, average people. This is a long due, unfinished task in our country, and I believe in many other democratic EU states. As Elena Rutinovska pointed out today, what happens now in Poland and Hungary could happen in any EU country. That is why we must truly understand what has already happened in these states, what were the early signs and signals which it took the EU and its member states too long to notify, to fully take into account and understand. Local human rights organizations in Poland and Hungary, such as our peer organizations, Polish Anti-Discrimination Law, Anti-Discrimination Law, Polish Helsinki Committee, Hungarian Helsinki Committee, and many, many others. Also international human rights organizations, such as our umbrella organization, International Federation for Human Rights, Amnesty International, Transparency International, and many others. We've all made several reports over the past years. Unfortunately, these reports and the warnings and the calls within them were not taken seriously enough. As we have heard, both the Polish and the Hungarian governments have used the legislation to their own political needs. And as so often in history, my friends, it is the minorities, such as sexual and gender minorities, and ethnic minorities, such as the Roma people, and women, who pay the heaviest price. A teenager belonging to sexual minority in the countryside in Poland or Hungary, a journalist, a pregnant asylum seeker pushed from Poland to Belarus, or a woman seeking for abortion. It is these everyday lives of people where the attack on the rule of law and on human rights materialize, as Heidi Hautala also noted earlier. We at the Finnish League for Human Rights, and I will close by this, we call upon the government of Finland and all governments and the EU to take stronger measures to ensure the rule of law and human rights are to be protected, and there will be swift measures in line of the principles of the Treaty of the European Union. As we speak, we are at the same time facing a more global threat to sexual reproductive rights, against rights of sexual and gender minorities, and against women. And these threats are coordinated, well-funded, and orchestrated. So we're also not only talking about European Union, as Tuomas Ojennan pointed out, we're talking about much broader international attacks on the very core of the human rights system. Dear participants and also dear human rights defenders who have been with us today, today we salute especially our friends, our fellow human rights defenders from Poland and Hungary. We stand in solidarity with you today and as you continue your professional work in your respective countries towards justice. Through you, we also salute all ordinary people and the population of your countries who fight for justice in their own ways every day. We trust and we know that the tide will turn and justice will prevail. Now it's our duty to continue learning, to continue documenting, and to support those who document human rights violations and erosion of democracy and rule of law in Poland and Hungary and any other country for that matter. Thank you for being with us. Tiedskutje, köszönöm, kiitos, tak, gitu, thank you.